Bad girl jackets. We also are matching because we were out drinking before this event, and we are trying.
We had a glass of rosé each. We
I
weren't
know.
doing tequila shots.
But
Let's be
here's
real.
the thing: it's a Corsican rosé, and while this book goes to
very
Sardinia,
delicious.
Corsica is very close. And in May, I am actually going to both Corsica and Sardinia, unless Stromboli decides to blow up, Naples and everything around it, which maybe is as serious as possible. But anyway, right. So we dressed to match the book jacket. Is this a great jacket? Do you like it? I know. So I'm going to take off my bad girl jacket because it's warm. Deanna,
Ma'am.
tell us a bit about Killers of a Certain Age, the first book in this series.
Before I do that, I want to make sure everybody can hear me. Okay, good, because I have a very bad habit of accidentally turning my mics off. And the other thing I want to do before we get started is just to say thank you so much for coming out, not for me and for the book, but for this amazing bookstore in your community. Because you are so lucky to have a phenomenal independent bookstore in your community, and it is gorgeous that you are supporting that. So kudos to all y'all for that. Okay,
That's so nice of you. Thank
I
you.
love an independent bookstore. Look, you guys are, I'm sorry, you're spoiled rotten, and I'm deeply envious. We have just now in my community gotten our own independent bookstore
Have
for the
you?
first time that in the 20 years that I have lived in that town. We have just now gotten one, and it's so new I haven't even had a chance to go in there yet. But I am smitten with independent bookstores because indies have, every one of them has a different vibe. Every one of them has a different joy. So if you're a book lover, I mean, this is church. This is church. Okay, so on to Killers of a Certain Age. That's what you asked about. So Killers of a Certain Age was the first book that came out in 2022, and it follows the adventures of 4 60-year-old female assassins who are about to retire, but the organization they work for would rather kill them than let them draw a pension. And they have to figure out exactly who's behind that and why, and they have to kind of turn the tables on these folks just for their own survival.
The organization is called.
The Museum.
Why did you call it the museum? That's a great title.
Thank you. So I called it the museum because I'm an art nerd. I love museums, and I thought it would be. When you look at the foundation of this organization they work for, the people who founded it were people who'd been very active in World War II. They some of them were former SOE, some of them were former OSS, some of them were former monuments men, and so not all of those people got to go on to work for MI5 and MI6 and the CIA. Some of those people were just kind of cast adrift with these incredible skills, like killing Nazis and no Nazis to kill. And so I started thinking, what would happen if you had this amazing skill set and nobody to practice it on? And then you turned around and you realized that a whole bunch of those Nazis that you had been targeting actually were still getting away with stuff. They weren't all held to account in Nuremberg. Some of them went to South Africa. Some of them went to South America. Some of them went to Canada. I imagine that at least a handful of those folks would have been good and annoyed that these people had escaped justice. And so they formed the museum, which was a largely vigilante organization. And their mission is to kill people who need killing. And the organization is set up with museum nomenclature. You have the acquisitions department, and those are the people who are figuring out who the targets need to be. You have provenance, which is another art term. It has to do with research and all the details that you need when you're putting together a kill list. And then you've got your curators who are kind of the keepers of the information. And it just seemed like a fun way to organize it. That's the best part about being a writer of fiction, is just getting to make up whatever you want. And my rule of thumb is it needs to be fun. So,
well, we certainly know that. How many of you read the Veronica Speedwell books? Any of those? Okay, so you already know that Deanna has a wonderful time making the Victorians more fun than they probably really were, right? I love the Lepidopterist. I love the fact that she, in a time when women didn't have much agency. I was able to do that. I really like all the characters in the book, and I'm happy to say that Deanna is actually writing the 10th in the Veronica
Veronica
Speedwell.
number 10. I'm writing it right now. It's with my editor, and it will come back to me at the end of March with notes, and I'll be revising it in April and May, and then it will go into production in June for a release next spring.
Yep. So that's always something to look forward to.
Oh, and a little teaser. If you happen to be a Julia Gray fan, and that is old, original
For original Deanna. Right.
Deanna, all I'm going to say is you're going to want Veronica 10.
Oh. Well, I really miss Julia. I've been after Deanna for years to write another Julia, but unfortunately, publishers change and rights stay with earlier publishers, and it gets to be very difficult if you change publishers to continue to write books in the original publisher series. So there's a lot I would do to reform publishing if I only had more power. But meantime, I love the Julia Grays, and if you can find them, I'm not sure, I think for a while I couldn't find them. Are they?
They're digital only.
That they are?
Yeah, they're
Okay.
no longer in physical print editions. They're
I
digital
was
only.
afraid of that, right. So anyway, I love them. But Veronica came along, and that made up for a lot. I'd like to think that there really was somebody. I mean, I love the Amelia Peabody books. They're a little bit later in time, but I always loved the idea that, she was able to go to Egypt and do all the things she did as an Egyptologist in a time when it was there were a few women that got to do that. There were always a few women, weren't there? But
Always.
just so few.
There's always somebody out there blazing that trail. But a lot of times those stories are erased, or they're forgotten, or they're suppressed. And so a lot of times we don't know about the women who were out there doing those things.
You're right.
Luckily, Elizabeth Peters, who I'm a huge Elizabeth Peters fan, and I'm sure you have Elizabeth Peters books well stocked
Well,
here.
there actually not that many available anymore.
Really?
Same problem. But
that's too bad.
I do keep the ones that we had. Have I ever told you, just as a total digression, but hang on, because this is what we do.
Talk amongst yourselves.
Right. No. Have I ever told you my Elizabeth Peters story? We were together at a convention at a BoucherCon in Seattle. So Elizabeth Peters' real name was Barbara Mertz, and she was a doctor. She had a PhD in, I think, Egyptology or archaeology from the University of Chicago. She was a very distinguished scholar. She wrote wonderful ghost stories and other things under the name Barbara Michaels, most of them set around the area sort of near where you live. A lot of them there. And then she wrote the Amelia Peabody series, which is about a 19th century woman Egyptologist who has a spectacular marriage as Elizabeth Peters. So that's who she was. Anyway, we were together in Seattle, and we were standing at the end of a corridor when there was a huge mystery convention going on, and a group of fans ran up to me and said, "We just love your book," she said. We're so excited that you're here, And anyway, she sat next to me. She stood next to me, and I could hear her sort of beginning to make little noises like a tea kettle coming to the boil. And this went on for a few minutes, and then she stepped forward and put out her hand. She said, "Hello," she said. "I'm Barbara Peters, and I have a great mystery bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona." She was so much fun. She really was. And we went to visit her in her home, and I will tell you that in her upstairs bathroom, it was completely painted in scenes from temples and tombs in
Oh, I love
Egypt and
that.
all. So I went downstairs, I'm polite, and I went downstairs and I asked her if I could photograph them because I felt it would be really sleazy to be up in her bathroom, shooting photos of everything. But it was so great. I really miss her. She was such a great character, but
She's one
good
of those
for
people
her.
I really wish
Yeah.
I could have met.
Well, but in a way, she kind of paved the way for people to love characters like Veronica.
She absolutely did. She absolutely did because her books were very original when they were being published. I don't think anybody else was doing like a Victorian explorer
No,
hero. So
no.
good for
So
her.
that's really great.
Good for her.
All right, so killers of a certain age. There was a gentleman years ago, Patrick, you're going to have to remember because I never can remember his name, who dealt with kind of a similar issue in that his father, who he always thought was a Washington machine salesman, developed dementia. And all of a sudden, this young man who thought his father was a washing machine salesman realized that people were trying to kill his dad. And why was that? And it turned out the reason was that the CIA in this couldn't afford to have one of their top assassins and spies develop dementia and give everything away. And I thought about that afterward. I wonder if that really is true. I mean,
It's
if
plausible.
it is plausible,
I
what
believe
would
it.
you do with a security leak? Sorry, what would you do if you had a security leak potential like that?
I don't know, but that sounds like a plot line for the
Exactly.
Killers 3.
Well, I mean, so what you have similarly is, some aging assassins, quote, assassin spies, who pose some kind of if not a threat, at least are a risk of some kind. At least they think they do to this organization. So if
And
it's just
yeah.
financial or
It's more a matter of when you have organizations like this that operate outside the law, as this organization absolutely does. When you have a power struggle, there's no one who's going to step in and take charge. It's going to be a bloodbath, and they're just going to fight to the death. And there's going to be collateral damage when that happens. And so they've targeted these women because they're part of a group that they think they need to get rid of in order to have a clear path to the succession. Yeah.
in fiction, it's always a black ops operation, right? It's not the actual CIA, although currently maybe it could be. But anyway,
Look, I live very close to the farm. And so, like, the black helicopters already go over my house. I'm not making enemies where I don't need to. I'm not naming any names that I don't need to be naming. I am
Okay.
not going to get myself in trouble.
So why don't you introduce us for those people who may not have read Killers of a Certain Age? By the way, I think these titles are great. Kills well with others. I mean, you got to love that. Right.
I take no credit for the titles, by the way.
Really?
No. I had the working title I had for Killers of a Certain Age was Hazy Shade of Winter, and they hated it. I mean, my editor got the book and she's reading through it. She was like, I love the book. The book is so good. Your title sucks. And she said, you can't have, actually, she was more polite than that, but she said, you absolutely cannot have the title. And I'm not precious about my titles. They're a group effort. The sales team has to weigh in. The marketing people weigh in. Everybody has to have a shot at that discussion. So I'm not precious about those, but I did really like Hazy Shade of Winter. And she was like, no, that's a poetry collection for someone who has clinical depression. You cannot have that for a thriller. And I said, all right, fine. And it was the vice president of PR, Craig Burke, who is an extraordinary human being, and I just like to say his name so that he knows how much I love him. He was the one who popped up with Killers of a Certain Age. And I said, that's gorgeous. I'm totally on board with that. So when I started writing the second one, I didn't even try to title it. Wow. I just said, when anybody asked me, I said, oh no, Craig's going to title the second one. It's fine. And so when I had to have a placeholder title, I was calling it, because I'm Gen X, I was calling it Killers 2 Electric Boogaloo. And that went in, even when when I was having emails with Ivan Held, the publisher, I was like, so he said, well, how's the book coming? And I said, oh, Killers 2 Electric Boogaloo is coming right along. He was like, you cannot have that title. I said, no, it's a placeholder. Craig is naming the book. It's fine. And so that was news to Craig. But Craig came up with Kills Well with Others, which I immediately fell in love with because I imagine there are probably one or two strong women in here who got the note on your report card, does not play well with others, like I did. So that was almost a wonderful little callback to Mrs. Smith and my first grade report card. She's dead now.
Yeah. I always think of Sue Grafton. That was kind of her signature thing. It was to say, didn't play well with others. Karen Slaughter is similar. So there are quite a few of us out there who don't play well with others. But let's talk about Billy, Mary Alice, Helen, and Natalie.
Yes.
Why don't you just sort of, because they're all different, even if they are a group,
They are. So we've got 4 assassins, and these women were all recruited when they were 20 years old in 1969. And they have been together ever since then. They literally know where the bodies are buried. They are very much found family, because if you take 4 20-year-olds and train them to be killers, I mean, first of all, these are young women who all have trauma in some way or another. They all have experienced a loss that makes them vulnerable to being recruited for this organization. And they all have a really kind of almost sweet, for killers, idealism.
How do you know that? I'm going to
guessing.
interrupt here. How do you know what's sweet for killers?
Guessing.
Okay.
You totally threw me
I
off.
know I did. I'm sorry. I realized too late. I just ruined your thought. I'm
Completely
sorry.
derailed my thought. No, they kind of have a very sweet idealism about the idea that they genuinely believe that they are making the world a better place, that the people that they kill need killing because they are just that awful. And if you remove them from the equation of humanity, everybody else is going to be just a little bit better off. Now, whether that is something people should run around doing is a completely different question. But they believe, because this is what they have bought into from the time that they're 20 years old, they believe that they're doing a good thing. And, they take us along for the ride. You've got Billy, who is a Texas woman, just absolutely bedrock strong, and she's the point of view character. She's the lens through which we see most of what happens. Natalie is the one that I would probably throw in front of a moving train because she is such a brat. She's the Amy March. If this is the family from Little Women, she's Amy. And then Mary Alice and Helen are. They bring more stability to the group. They kind of have a little more grown-up vibe. Helen is very kind of East Coast patrician. Her father was a senator. And then Mary Alice is the only one who has a good marriage. She's the one she married late in life. She married when she was about 55, and she and her wife have Norwegian forest cats, and they are happy and they are stable. And everybody else in the group struggles a little bit with their personal lives because, how do you kill for a living and then go home and make a lasagna?
Excellent point, and we'll come back to that. But I want to talk a little bit.
Don't ask me because I don't know personally. I feel like you're trying to spread rumors here, Barbara.
Maybe Deanna and I are actually secretly employed by the museum. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit because 40 years is, that's the time gap here from the time gap, according to back of the book here. I was refreshing my memory. And therefore, they had what were then called, are now called old school skills.
They do.
But the thing is that everything that I read about spy fiction now says that technology is so hackable and so forth that old school skills, the newspaper drop, meeting, the whole bit, old school skills are coming back. And in real life, not just in fiction, but in real life, in espionage, that the old sort of thing.
I can absolutely believe it.
Well,
yeah. And in
I've had
one,
discussions with people like Brad Thor and Mark Graney and all the rest of it, and we all have said that while technology, you have to figure out a lot now about how to disable the technology. You don't want to be tracked. You don't want to be hacked. All those different things. If you're any kind of a criminal, what's the first thing you ought to learn? Leave your phone at home. That's the and they never do. They absolutely never do.
No,
even the rioters here.
True
Remember?
Crime that any documentary that you're watching, the second somebody's going to go commit a murder, I'm always like, leave your phone at home. They
That's
never
right.
leave the phone at home.
No.
You don't deserve to be out there murdering people.
Not only that, not only did they not leave their phones at home, but they post on social media in real time.
Killing it.
I know. So, I think that your ladies, while they might have sort of like phased out, are actually phasing back in.
Well, because in book one, they are thrown out of their comfort zone. They don't have the resources of the organization because they're operating kind of beyond the pale, and they only can rely on what they know and what they can do and the connections that they have personally made and the skills that they have honed. And so they are without, for better or worse, their version of a Q, Bond's quartermaster with all his fancy little gadgets. They don't have access to that. So they've got to figure out, okay, if I'm going to walk into Walgreens, what can I figure out to use to kill somebody with? Because and you totally can, which I just realized kind of plays into a lot of what you've been suggesting tonight already. So I should probably keep that to myself.
We should have stopped on our way here.
I know.
Right.
But and if you know what you're doing, you absolutely can walk down an aisle of any drugstore, any grocery store, and find a million different things to use, because so much of what surrounds us is toxic or dangerous if you know what you're doing. And they absolutely do. So, and, plus they're traveling a lot in these books. They have to cross borders. And traveling with handguns, it's frowned upon. You can't necessarily bring a harpoon with you. So what are you going to use weapon-wise? It's best to be able to rely on things that don't look like weapons in the first place.
Excellent point. Yeah. So, spoiler, they survive. That's why we have book 2, Kills Well with Others. So there's a little bit of suspense for those of you who did not read the first book. A little bit of the suspense is alleviated. But now we're moving on to Kills Well with Others. And I was so excited to read this because they are setting sail in this book. So what ship are they on and why are they going somewhere?
They are on, God, where did I put them? Queen Mary 2?
You're guessing?
Look, I've written a whole other book since then.
Okay. So it is the Queen Mary 2.
Okay. I knew it was a canard liner. I couldn't remember
it definitely
which one
is, which takes me back to yet another digression. But my husband's cousin was for a while treasurer of Cunard, and his mother decided, for all of us, that the sigh is important, that we would go on the maiden voyage of the Queen Mary 2. Which was not a particularly exciting itinerary. You went from New York to Fort Lauderdale to somewhere in the Bahamas to Dakar, Senegal, and to the Azores, Lisbon, and then Southampton, all of which I'd already done, so I wasn't too excited to go on this trip. But the key part is that it was in 2002, and because of 9/11, the Queen Mary 2 was escorted by a full-gun sort of destroyer, because it was such a target that, the assumption was that maybe they...
So you had a whole bunch of British sailors just...
On a separate ship. They were in front of us. and I didn't...
Did you wave at them?
Well, here's what happened. I didn't...
That was a yes.
The Queen Mary 2 is a large ship. Now it's only like half the size of one of the Disney ships, but it was like 2,500 people. It's very awkward to try to unload and reload 2,500 people in a short space of time anywhere you go. So we don't do big ships. But anyway, we arrive without incident in Dakar, Senegal. And the thing that everybody wants to go and see is an island out in front of Dakar, Senegal, which was the center of the slave trade. And the slave trade actually worked that Africans preyed on other Africans and brought them up and sold them to Arabs, and then the Arabs sold them to the Europeans, and that transaction took place on this island. The ferry to go out to the island held 500 people, and with no one paying any attention, suddenly 900 people boarded the ferry. And I realized at that moment that the gunboat was the only thing that would save us from sinking into the harbor at Dakar, Senegal, if the ferry went down. So I was really excited to have the gunboat for the rest of the trip. But it was memorable. So
It would have been an interesting way to die, Barbara. I mean, it would have made a great story for your obituary.
Right, which I would not have written. Anyway, but I was so excited to see your 4 people set sail on the Queen Mary 2, because I've actually been on it.
Well, then, if I'd known that ahead of time, it would have made me nervous when you were reading it, but because I would have been I would have been
Worried that I would have picked holes in what
Yep.
you had to say?
so she
Never.
could actually been on there. No, we were actually, my husband and I had actually booked passage on there because now Queen Mary 2 mostly just crosses the Atlantic a lot of the time. That's what
Well,
it does.
it
They
is.
do some other things, but
Yeah.
they do mostly it's a crossing between like New York and Southampton.
There's a big difference between
yeah.
a liner and a cruise ship.
Uh-huh.
And both the
And-
Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, the new generation, were built to replace the old generation, are really just for transatlantic crossing. I actually went on the Queen Mary 1 and 2 when I was 15 going to Europe and back. And I have to tell you that they did not compare in any sort of luxury to the new iteration. But the Queen Mary 2 and the Queen Elizabeth 2, which has now been junked, are really old ships now. That's the other part.
They
It's
are.
a
They
long time
absolutely
for
are.
a ship.
And we had, I love to travel when I possibly can to the settings that I'm going to be using in the books. And so we had actually booked passage on Queen Mary 2 for a crossing and ended up scrapping it because my daughter got pregnant. And I am a grandmother now. And he is super adorable.
And she has a photo she'll be happy to show you when you sign your book.
He looks like a Pixar character. He has great big eyes. And so we scrapped that, but I do absolutely love going to the settings when I possibly can. That's the travel just kind of informs the books in a way that is so much fun. And it was I was just getting ready to sit down and start writing this one when I had a sudden thought, and I told my husband, I said, "Yeah, I need to go to Venice, like this week." And so he said, "Well, sure, twist my arm." And so a week later, we were in Venice, which is a hugely, like, massive privilege that we were able to do that on such short notice. But went to Venice and stayed there for a week. And everything that you read in the scenes in Venice are things that I actually did, apart from the murders. Disclaimer. But I was like sitting there, I would map out what was going to happen in this place. And it was so incredible. I've never been in a city in my life which feels more like a film set because every corner you turn, you keep expecting, oh, where's the McDonald's? And they don't have one. Like, it is just so completely itself. And it's almost an extra character in the book. And so the section that's in Venice is absolutely a love letter to that city because it was amazing. I did not make it to Sardinia, so you'll have to read that section. When you've been to Sardinia, you can go back to that section.
So if any of you subscribe, I think it was in the New York Times last weekend, Sardinia is actually offering a home to any American who wishes to move away from America for $1. $1. You can buy a home in Sardinia. There are no.
I think you have to fix it up a little bit.
Yeah,
but,
it's a serious village fixer-upper, but nonetheless. And there are also some villages in Italy that are not quite at the dollar level, but quite inexpensive, where lots of the villages have been left mostly empty because the younger people have moved to the big cities and all the rest of it. And so they're seeing an opportunity here to bring in people to, to settle them. I haven't been to Sardinia either yet, but I thought your scenes here in Sardinia were wonderful. So how did you watch videos? I mean, how did you arrive at such a really great depiction of Sardinia?
I didn't watch videos for that. What I actually did was this is one of my writer cheats. Is I will go and find books about a place that are not just travel guides and not just histories. I will go look for things like cookbooks that are written. I will look if I can find an author who grew up in that place and spent time there as a child and then wrote a memoir about it. I did that with Rumer Godden because she spent of the fact that when I was writing a book that was set in India, if you spend time in a place as a child, you experience it completely differently than if you experience the time there as an adult. You notice different things. Your sensory memories are completely different. Kids will notice things that are down here as opposed to up here. They're not looking as much at architecture. Kids will pay a lot of attention to vibe. They will tell you how a place feels. They will remember all sorts of really interesting little details. And a lot of times they remember very acute sensory details like how a place smells which we don't talk a lot sometimes about how places smell. But if I sit there and think hard enough, I know exactly what London smells like. I know exactly what Mykonos smells like. I can tell you what these places, I can conjure the memory based on what the smell was. And that, yeah, I have a lot of little cheats like that I use when I can't actually make it to a place. I'd love to be able to go every place that I write about, but it's not always feasible, unfortunately.
So let's go back and talk about why are the four women setting sail on the Queen Mary 2?
So they're under fire again. They have, there is a new threat to them that is based on a case, a mission that we see in the first book, which was a complete accident because when I wrote the first book, I didn't know for sure there was going to be a second one. And then when I sat down to write the second one, I said, okay, now what? And I went back and it just occurred to me, we need to have somebody who's a throwback, somebody who has a grudge from one of their previous missions that we've seen them carry out. Who could it be? And then I realized I had laid in, I wish I could take credit. I wish I could tell you I'm some sort of plotting genius and that this was brilliant and intentional, and it absolutely was accidental 100%, that I had a mission that worked perfectly for this. And I'd laid in everything that I needed to use. The only thing that I knew for sure going into the second book was that at some point they were going in disguise as Playboy bunnies at the club. That's the only, and that is not a spoiler. It's page 1. They are at the Playboy Club in Chicago, and if you have read book 1, then you will know how much Billy is going to hate being in the bunny ears and serving cocktails to gropey jerks. So I had to do it to her because that was a way to torture her.
You couldn't really resurrect Hugh Hefner, though, could you? That's too bad. It would have been
No,
so
and
much.
this is a flashback scene to, I think it's 1981 is what the flashback is that the book opens with, which at that point the Playboy clubs were not like, when they first opened in the late 60s, they were swanky, they were sophisticated, they were very Rat Pack chic. By 1981, they were skeevy. And so not only do they have to go undercover doing this really kind of gross thing, they're doing it in a really gross place. And so I thought that's going to be a fun thing to do to them. And I stuck them there for 3 months.
Okay.
So.
But why are they on the Queen Mary 2?
Because I had to get them from one place to another on the trail of a person who does not fly.
Right. No, I get it. But I mean, the part of the fun of these books is the travel and the forward momentum. Mm-hmm. So you took them on the Queen Mary 2 from what, New York to Southampton?
Yes, as part of the crossing, they have to get from North America to England, and they're doing it in pursuit of someone who will not fly. So because this character is on the ship,
right,
they have to be on the ship. And so they have to kind of conceal what they're doing while they're taking watercolor classes and, listening to lectures in the planetarium and availing themselves of all the shipboard amenities.
Right, which is like a 5-day crossing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so then they move on to Venice. Why do they move on to Venice?
They move on to Venice because they have to. They are tracking whoever is after them, and Venice is their opportunity to turn the tables. Because by that point, they've figured out exactly who it is who's after them, who's targeting them, and in order for them to get one step ahead of this character, Venice is where they've got to go.
Excellent. Yeah. So one of the women, if I remember right, has a home that she really loves. It's in England, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so that home comes into play in the book too. I really like that.
It does. I love it. It's not a stately home, but it is a home that of some stature. It's called Benscombe, and it is the place where they were trained in starting in 1969 when they were recruited by their mentor. Who had been very active, and she was a legend in World War II, and she is training them as the first all-female group of assassins in this organization. And so they're trained at this place in England, which I loved writing those scenes, the training scenes in the first book. We have some flashbacks in the first book. And so in book 2, they get to go back and revisit that house one more time. And we get to see it in a flashback as well. And get little pieces of their history while we also see them as 60-year-old women trying to contend with, this new threat to their existence and the aches and pains which come from being 60 and trying to kick somebody's ass.
And they move on to Sardinia, and we won't say any more about how all that works out. How is it, you're used to writing historical fiction. I mean, we've had Julia and we have Veronica, but this is more current. So is it easier to research all the way back in the Victorian era where things are clearly different than it is in like the 1980s where it's possibly easier to go wrong or forget about that it's in the past?
Well, I remember the 1980s, so there's not that much that I'm worried about with that regard, because the characters are 62, about 62 in this book, and they're only 5 years older than I am. So culturally, the things like I remember when Rumors dropped in the 70s, and everybody was listening to Fleetwood Mac. And it was such a huge deal because I had cousins who were the age of these women. So all of the pop culture stuff was really more a matter of just remembering. And the fact that those are considered to be historical scenes now kills a little part of my soul. Because if you ask me, I will tell you that 1970 was 30 years ago. That's just math. That's just math.
1970 was a lot more than 30 years ago.
No, it was not. It was 30 years ago.
Got it.
No,
Well,
I did the actual arithmetic and found out that next year will be my 40th high school reunion, and then I infarcted a little. But no, I've done probably, I think we're up to almost about 20 books now that I've written.
Okay.
And 18 of those were historical. I think 3 set in the 1920s, and then all the rest are Victorian. So Victoriana is definitely a comfort zone for me. There's a baseline of knowledge, so I'm not kind of having to go back and relearn all of that when I go to start a Veronica Speedwell book, because those are set. I think now we're up to like 1890 in the Veronica books. So there's a comfort level there with that setting, a baseline of that. I think that the main research that I have to do for the Killers books is just figuring out how to kill people.
Okay. Well, I didn't ask my question very well. I think what I meant was that in the Veronicas, you've had to do, at least as you say, a baseline of research. When you're writing these books, you remember all this, and so it must be a very different kind of writing experience.
It is. There's a definite gear shift, when I'm done with a Veronica book and I have to switch to something like this. And honestly, one of the biggest ways that I do that is music. I have on Apple Music, I have a Killers of a Certain Age playlist, and that is the first thing that goes into rotation. And it's got things like American Woman, and it's got some early Fleetwood Mac, and it's got Hazy Shade of Winter. 3 different versions, because it does. It's got that in there, so I've got all of these things that to me are the soundtrack of their experiences are in this playlist. And so I'll put that on immediately to get me into a completely different headspace. And then I make sure that, like, when I'm writing this, I'm not watching Bridgerton. I'm not watching anything historical. I'm focused more. I may rewatch Atomic Blonde or something like that instead to kind of get me in the right headspace when I'm starting off with something like this that's more, kick-ass adventure, getting things done, as opposed to, listening to the soundtrack of Crimson Peak, which I might be doing if I'm writing Veronica.
Got it. So the pacing in your books feels very similar to me, because Veronica moves, not at a Victorian pace, but a accelerated pace. Well, actually, the Victorians moved very fast. Think of all the things they did and all the places they went. So it's probably, but I just read, who is it? Ellie Griffith has a book in which there's some time travel, and one of the women goes back to the Victorian age, and in order to do the time travel, they dress her in what a Victorian woman in like 1850 would have worn, and it's appalling. I mean, it is appalling.
1850?
Yeah.
Oh, that's hideous.
I mean, they're
That's-
like 9 petticoats, one made out of horsehair. There's, a basic garment, there's a corset, there's, pantaloons that have no crotch because otherwise you could never actually pee because you could never move everything out of the way in time and all. And you couldn't really do anything. I mean, you were truly
and
caged.
that was the entire point,
Right.
was to restrict female movement because you were not supposed to be doing, because doing was for people who didn't have money or didn't have refinement, or you were supposed to be the beautiful little Victorian angel of the hearth, and you were up on your pedestal and you weren't supposed to be getting your hands dirty. We're literally going to restrict your movement by corseting your little ribs and giving you all these, although corsets were supposed to be a little bit more comfortable than we think they are, but it's the crinoline and the petticoats that would have absolutely killed me. And they killed a lot of them. You brush up against a candle, you're done.
Yeah. No, it's true. There were a lot of women who were incinerated because they couldn't get out of their clothes. They went too close to
And
the.
they did not know to stop, drop, and roll.
Was it Walt Whitman's wife? Which was the New England author? Was it Hawthorne Whitman? Anyway, his wife burned to death in front of him because she was standing close to a fire and her clothes went up. In a way, it's sort of like the bound feet of the Chinese. The whole attempt there was to keep the women, from being able to do anything. They had to be weighted down. The servants in 1850 were not wearing corsets and all the rest of it. They were wearing long dresses, but they could move around.
They were not caged up in the crinolines. They didn't have 9 petticoats. They absolutely were not doing that. They had to be able to move around and to get things done. They had to be able to haul firewood and to haul water and to cook and take care of the babies and do all that sort of thing. So yeah, they had a very different experience than the lady of the house, who's supposed to be the embodiment of Victorian virtue.
Right. So Veronica in 1890 is in a different kind of costume, but she has. Did she, like Amelia Peabody, who created a split skirt so she could actually, walk?
Veronica has a hunting costume she
Right.
wears where she wears slim trousers and then she wears a skirt over it that she'll button up to kind of get it out of the way if she needs to. Yeah, for sure,
Right.
for ease of movement. But for one of the Veronica books, I had mountaineers, female mountaineers, and if you ever see any pictures of the original female mountaineers, it's astonishing because one of them, a French woman, would climb. She climbed Mont Blanc in a feather boa, with her velvet jacket and her skirts, and she would take her skirt off and hide it behind a bush and climb in trousers, but she would have all these other little embellishments with her, and then she would drink half a case of champagne at the top and totter on back down the mountain. And I hope she remembered where she put her skirt.
I've always disliked the fact that French women know how to tie scarves. Have you ever noticed that? I mean, that's one of those fashion things that just. I have traveled with French women, and they always look so chic, and their scarves are always perfect. And I always feel like a schlub, next to them. So your woman who climbed Mont Blanc was right in that tradition.
She absolutely was.
Yeah, right. So, what else do we want to say, if anything, about Kills Well with Others?
I had a ball writing it.
That's an excellent thing, right? We won't even tell you if everybody survived. You're going to have to read the book, figure it out. How about questions for?
No, and I will tell them there is
What?
a significant chicken in the book.
Oh, there is.
There is
right.
a chicken of significance in the book.
I'd forgotten about the chicken.
There is a chicken of significance. Yep.
Right. Okay. So on that note, questions from any of you for Deanna? We need you to repeat the question for the camera, too, in case anybody puts their hand
Absolutely.
up. Ah, there's a brave person.
The question was, do you need to read book 1 to enjoy book 2? You do not have to. It is a standalone. As a reader, I always like to start with the first book because you get a little more backstory, you get a little more context. So I would recommend starting with the first one, but you don't if you are a rebellious spirit, then you do whatever makes you happy. Okay. Book one is Killers of a Certain Age.
Right. And
And
I
you
noticed
have
in the
plenty
hard
of copies.
well, we do, and I noticed in the hardcover that our sole remaining hardcover is in an 8th printing. So obviously, yeah,
Are you serious?
I am. I just looked before we got up here. So
Really?
yeah, so it obviously did very well.
Okay, I never knew anything past the second.
They come here to learn, right? That's the way it goes, right?
Well, that's amazing.
Right. Yay. So
And I found out today that Kills Well with Others is a USA Today bestseller. So I'm very excited about that.
you should be.
I
Many
am.
congratulations
Thank
there.
you.
All right.
Thank you, thank
Who
you,
else
thank
has a
you.
question they'd like to? Oh, lots
Okay,
of
I
hands now.
saw this on this side over here in purple first. Hi.
So I actually finished the book last week. I got it from the library.
Okay, no spoilers. Okay.
But it's great. Are you working on the third?
The question is, am I working on the third book? Because she's already finished the book. You guys are way behind. The short answer is no, not yet. Because I'm not actually under contract for that. That's a discussion that I'll be having with my publishers when I go up there in June. We'll discuss whether there's going to be a third book. I would love to write a third one. There's already a title for it.
I nearly drowned right
I
there.
know. Sorry.
Does Craig know that?
Craig is going to be out of a job. Yes, actually, I did tell Craig because once again, I did not come up with the title. My husband did, gave it to me, and so I waited until I was sitting across the table from Craig, and he had just taken a drink, and I told him the title, and he was like, "It's perfect." So it remains to be seen if there is a book 3, and if there is, whether they will let me keep this title, but it's pretty good.
I mentioned the 8th printing because that generally gets publishers encouraged to carry on if they think the book has sold well. Yay.
Indeed.
Yep.
Indeed. Yeah. So I would love to do a third one. I think the characters
I
are
certainly
so
think,
much fun to
yeah.
write.
Trilogies have a nice symmetry to
They
them
do.
too. You know,
They do. I feel like we need a third book to tie things up. We really do.
right? This lady over here.
Yeah, I
had
know
a
we had
question.
another one over here.
I'm just curious, did you get any pushback about writing about mature women?
Did I get any pushback about writing about mature women? No, it was their idea. Yes. So this is how it happened. They were having a meeting at my publisher's office in New York. Everybody was sitting around the conference table, and somebody raised the question, why do we not have more books about older women doing kick-ass things? And everybody around the table said, yeah, why don't we? And then somebody else said, we need to. And somebody else said, but who would write it? And apparently they all said my name at the same time, which I took as a tremendous compliment. So they asked my editor to come and see if I would be interested in writing something about older women doing something really cool. That was literally the brief. Would you be interested in writing a book about older women doing something cool? And I said, yes, absolutely. I said, let me go have a little noodle, figure out what I want to do. And so I came back a week later and I said, absolutely, I want to do this. But instead of, because usually, like in my Victorian mysteries, it's one character and a hot sidekick. Both of my Victorian series, one main character, hot sidekick. I said, I want to do 4 characters this time. I want to really play with that dynamic of 4 women working together. And they said, we love that. That's fantastic. I said, I would like them to be assassins, because is there anything cooler and more badass than actually getting to kill? They said, love it. That's great. And then I told them I wanted it to be contemporary. And that was the needle scratch of the record, where they were like, oh, okay. To their credit, here's the thing with publishers. They are what I call small c conservative. If you are in a pigeonhole as a writer, they love for you to stay there. They will beautifully furnish that pigeonhole for you because you're doing something and you're doing it well. Booksellers know where to shelve you. They know how to hand sell you to somebody who comes in because they know exactly what you are. Librarians know who you are. You know, reviewers on Instagram and TikTok know exactly who you are. And so it makes it very easy for them. And they know what they're getting from your books. And to take a chance and say, yes, you who have literally only ever written historical fiction, we totally trust you to write a contemporary thriller. So it wasn't just a different time period, it was a different genre. To get the chance to do that, to have them trust me to do that, was insane. But I was incredibly fortunate, and give them all the credit in the world for taking that chance. And then I panicked for 2 years trying to write it because it was so far out of my comfort zone in every possible way. That was a lot of stress, but it turned out fine. 8th printing. I'm so excited.
So you remember the comment I made earlier, we both made about, not playing well with others. I really wish that authors would write different things. I try to encourage them to write different things. I do events for authors that other bookstores sometimes turn down because, it's going to be unpredictable.
You're a rebel, Barbara.
I am a rebel. I don't like the Indie Next List. Any of you know what the Indie Next List is? It's a marketing thing that started out with good intentions, and now I think it's really homogenized bookselling to a degree that I don't like. I know bookstores that their only display is books that from the Indie Next List, and also I'm a born rebel, so I tend to reject all that.
What I love about indies is the fact, and the reason that you get such a different vibe in every indie you go to is the personalities of the booksellers are reflected. The communities that their store is in, that personality is reflected. And so I love to see how different and idiosyncratic every bookstore is, the different places in the country.
There's kind of a natural tension between publishers wanting you to do everything just the same but different, and booksellers who would like you to do something, different.
Yeah.
So it is kind of a constant tension there.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Sorry. Anyway, I digress, as I always do. Who's next?
I'm just curious what your favorite scene to write is, scene or character, and then what you find your most difficult scene or character.
Why would you ask me such a hard question? So the question was, what is my favorite or most fun scenes to write, and then what are my most difficult? The most difficult, purely from a logistical standpoint, are the action scenes, because you constantly have to keep track, and the more characters you have, the more logistically difficult it is, because you're always having to keep track of who's doing what to whom, what the results of that are, and how that's going to play out in the rest of the scene. Because if you have just landed a massive kick to somebody's solar plexus and knocked the wind out of them, they're not going to immediately pop back up and hit you back. There has to be a beat there. How do you show the impact of that to them? And so I sometimes, my husband has done a fair bit of directing, so he's very familiar with stage choreography and combat and things like that. So he can say, I can run something past him and say, okay, if I have this character doing this to that character, and he's like, no, they've got a broken arm. They can't, no, they're done. You can't. And so we'll have discussions like that where I can use him as a resource and say, is this realistic? And I'll ask him to read through the action scenes. And actually, there was one place we were in Venice, and you will know what it is when you get to it in the book, where we stood in that place, literally working out the action sequence, going, all these tourists are there with their little selfie sticks, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm trying to kill somebody. Can you, and trying to work out exactly what the implications would be. The most fun is when they're bitching at each other. It's the banter. That is so much fun. I love writing when they're getting on each other's nerves. That is my absolute favorite. I love to push their buttons and just kind of let them at each other. Because at the end of the day, they're going to scrap, but they're still always going to have each other's backs. So it's fun to push that just a little bit and see how far I can get them to go. Yes, ma'am.
You named a couple authors, but who are your favorite authors?
Who are my favorite authors? Why would you ask me such a hard question? I absolutely adore Jessie Q. Sutanto. She is a phenomenal writer. She has a new book that's getting ready to come out, the second Vera Wong book. Speaking of older women doing kick-ass things, and I will name drop just a titch and tell you that I've met Jessie in person. We're published by the same publisher. She is an extraordinarily lovely human being. So buy her books because she's lovely and she's an
There's
awesome
a new book
writer.
out in April.
There
right?
you go. It's April. So I love her. And then
Are you reading something at the moment that you really like?
yeah, you and I were talking about this earlier. I just finished, and this is not the reason I'm hesitating is because I can't remember the author's name. It is a biography of Pamela Harriman that just came out a couple of months ago called Kingmaker, which is superb. Do you remember the author's name? No, I don't. Okay.
Everybody should read that.
Okay, right? It's so good. If you're not familiar with Pamela Harriman, she was Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law during World War II, and everybody's lover. She was brokering a lot of relationships that needed to be brokered during World War II. Men who needed to know other men because they could work together for the war effort. Pamela made sure that they were all in a good mood. And she did so with basically with a wink and a smile from Winston, who said, "Yeah, girl." And so she was a fascinating character, and she went from that to eventually becoming our ambassador to France. She was just an extraordinarily interesting woman. So yeah, so that's a book I've been recommending quite a lot lately to people.
Anyone else?
Yes.
These four characters that you're writing about so successfully, do you have any imprints on your own mind and multiple personalities that linger in your mind as you finish the book?
The characters themselves? Okay, so the question was, do I have, amongst these four characters, do I have anybody who kind of hangs around when I'm done writing and is a part of me? The one that I feel most closely connected to is Billy. Largely because she's the POV character. She's the lens through which we see the action, not of the flashback scenes. Those are all third person. But everything that's happening present day, we see through Billy's eyes. I gave her a couple of characteristics that are particularly close to me and meaningful to me. I made her a Texan. And that's my background. And it was an homage to the Texas women that I knew growing up, who were just rock solid, incredibly resilient, strong women who had a crap ton of life hit them in the face and just never gave up. And I gave her the name of my favorite great aunt, who died about 20 years ago. Who was an extraordinarily dynamic character. They don't really have anything in common beyond that, but the name was definitely an homage, kind of just a little love letter to those Texas women. So she sticks around. But like I said, if Natalie stuck around, I'd push her under a bus. I couldn't cope if Natalie stuck around. Yes. Do I have fun picturing who's going to play them in the movies? What movies? I actually had, from the minute I started plotting Killers of a Certain Age, I had a photograph of Diane Lane taped to my computer as Billy, because Diane Lane is 60. Like, she is that age. And I remember right before I sat down and started writing the book, that I was watching Superman, where she's playing Clark's adoptive mother. And I think the same week, I don't know why it was a very superhero heavy week, but I was watching Spider-Man also, where Marissa Tomei is playing Peter Parker's aunt. And all I could think was these gorgeous, strong, dynamic women who are looking down a very short road to 60, where are their capes? Why don't they get to be the superheroes? And so that kind of was just an extra, impetus to really make these characters as dynamic as I possibly could. But that photograph I've got of Diane Lane just gets me every time because I'm like, yeah, I would love that. I would love that. So that would be some dream casting. Yeah. Yes.
I'm always kind of fascinated by the whole process of writing. Like, do you go in and work certain hours a day, or do you wait till you get inspired and then lock yourself away?
So the question is, it's about writing process. Do I wait till I get inspired? Do I go in at certain times a day? The problem with waiting until you get inspired is you have deadlines. And if you wait till you get inspired, everything else in the world will be more important than sitting your ass in the chair and getting the book done. Like you will find you will suddenly need to alphabetize your spice cabinet. Oh, I need to clean the lint trap out of, the dryer for an hour. You will literally come up with anything you possibly can. Discipline is that's it right there, is you have to go in and get the work done because you have to get the work done. I'm a morning person, so I tend to write in the morning. I only ever brainstorm onto giant sheets of newsprint, like 2 by 3 feet sheets of newsprint with markers. And I only ever write on the computer. So they're completely different processes. They're finding out, I know that kids today don't tend to handwrite as much, but they're finding now that handwriting forges different neural pathways than keyboarding. And so I use that for brainstorming, for the creative work. And then when I'm writing the scene, it's almost like I'm taking dictation because I already know everything that's going to happen. I see it. Some writers don't picture, I see it as if it's a movie playing out. So for me, it's a very visual process. So I'm just describing what I'm seeing and it's already kind of fitted together. That makes sense. Yeah. You're welcome. Yes.
Can you tease anything from the next Veronica novel?
Can I tease anything from the next Veronica novel? I already did. No, and I'll tell you the reason that I can't is because I don't have my editor's feedback yet. So she and I will have some discussions about what stays in that book and what doesn't stay in that book. And so I would be devastated if I teased something for you and then it didn't make the book. But I can tell you what I already teased will definitely make the book. So there you go.
Do you get really heavy editing for the Veronicas?
No, it's not heavy.
You don't generally?
No, it's not heavy, but sometimes I'm my own worst enemy because the last Veronica book that came out was called A Grave Robbery. And I sent it into my editor on a Friday. And Monday morning, I emailed her and said, I'm really sorry, can I have it back? And she said, why? And I said, because the murderer is wrong. And I need to rewrite the last half of the book. And she said, can you do it in 3 weeks? I said, yeah. And she said, then you can have it back. So she gave me the book back and I rewrote that. I rewrote the entire last half of that book because my subconscious was still tinkering with it. So that did not come from my editor. That came from me being stupid and deciding, because sometimes your subconscious just doesn't let go of it. And you can turn it in and you think you're done with it and then stuff is still percolating, and then you wake up and go, oh no, I got the murderer wrong. So, and it actually is much better for having a different killer. So, yes, ma'am.
Were you a writer as a young child?
Was I a writer as a young child? I remember being so incredibly happy when I learned how to print because I could get the stories out of my head and onto my little Big Chief tablet, which is like not a thing anymore because I feel like it's like racially insensitive to have it's some sort of racial appropriation, I think, to have a Big Chief tablet. But that was a very big thing in the 70s. They were these tablets that, again, they were newsprint. Now that I think about it, they were newsprint. But I was so stupidly excited when I learned how to write because I could finally get those stories out and I could stop bugging my parents by telling them those stories.
Did you learn to write cursive?
Print first, but then cursive.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's amazing that they're not even teaching cursive, although one would like it. I mean, because you can do it so much faster.
That's what I don't understand. It's so much faster. But how do you? I don't. Okay. How do you learn how to do a signature if you don't write cursive? How do they sign their names?
I
They
guess
just they print them. Is that what they do? They just print their names. But you
it's
can't
all
do that with
DocuSign,
flair.
right?
You can't.
Shape and adopt it as their signature.
You know what? I kind of believe that that's true. All right. Do we have time for any more? Do we have any more?
What time is it?
What time is it? I don't know.
I think it's uncomfortable to sit in these chairs for much more. we usually run for an hour because then I see people starting to squirm because the chairs are not super comfortable. But the problem is that we have to move the furniture to do this, and if we had better chairs, we couldn't get them out of the way, and then we'd be stuck. So
Do we have
that's
one
our
final
deal.
one to wrap it up with? Or
Sure.
are we done? Okay. Do we have a final one? Or are we good to go? All right.
Everybody's
Then
paralyzed.
thank you very much.
Right.
From the waist down, they can't move.
That's right. Thank you very much for coming. I apologize for the fact that generally I bring a book that is going to come out, an advanced reading copy, and give it away, and I forgot to do that. So I guess what I could do, since we do have a copy of, where's the lady who asked? Yes, I'm going to pass this back to the woman who thought maybe she should read it from the beginning, okay? There we are. All right. So we lost, $11.98 or whatever it is. So
Now
that's
you
okay.
can buy something else.
Right, not at all. No, it's really a pleasure to be able to welcome you all here and to encourage you to read authors that you might not have read. Let me just clarify for a moment what I had to say about Indie Next. There is never a day when I don't get between 15 and 20 solicitations from publishers about voting their book to be part of the Indie Next list. And the reason that it has become such a marketing thing is there is an organization that for bookstores who don't really read, there are unfortunately a lot of bookstores that don't really read the books they sell because they don't have time. They're small staff. There's like 15, at a minimum of 1,500 new books published every week. So I totally understand why it is almost impossible to keep up. So what they do is they give their mailing list to this one organization, and it has over 900,000, therefore, readers from all these bookstores. And they come up with a list based upon recommendations, quote, of about 20 books, and that's what goes out there, and that's what all these bookstores sell. Now, every week, I report to the New York Times our sales, which is why Deanna and other authors are here. BookScan, which is a different thing, takes our sales and reports it to USA Today and the Wall Street Journal and other people that do bestseller lists. The American Bookseller Association that runs the Indie Next program has its own bestseller list. And I look at it, and it bears no resemblance to our list at all. And it's the same books week after week. You are lucky if this whole independent bookstore group has one or two new books that come onto their list. Mostly it's James, or it's Lessons in Chemistry, or it's whatever. It's so homogenous. And it's just, I don't want to participate in that, so I don't recommend books to Indie Next because I just don't want to be a part of that system. Every once in a while, I will put a quote from one of them into the book news because I think that you should kind of be aware of it, and maybe that list will matter to you. There's a different list. This is probably boring, but I'm going to tell you anyway. From librarians, and it's called Library Reads, and that is a similar thing where librarians are polled and asked to recommend every month 10 books that they think are really going to be interesting to their readers. And again, there's pressure on the librarians from publishers to nominate their books and do that. So what I object to is the homogenization across the board of these two lists, so that I would like to think that every bookstore is quirky and individual, and you come here to see what we like to read. And, we have entirely different reading paths for our staff. So Patrick and I and John and Pat and all, we'd all recommend different books to you. And after a while, you probably bond with one of us and you think, okay, you know, if John likes that book, that's the book I'm going to read, whatever. You can't do that in that other system. So that's why I was being kind of snarky about it, but for a good reason, because otherwise I think too many books get shut out if you have a system like that. So I encourage you to try different things. I love it when you write different things, or any author writes different things, you know, because the more readers we can bring in, and young readers, the better off we all are.
Amen.
Yeah. So that's my speech. Thank you all very much for coming tonight.
Thank you so much.
If you would fold up your chairs and put them over on that side, and then you have a number, so if you could kind of line up by numbers. And Deanna, you have pens, and you'll be better off to sort of stay here to sit or stand because you're at photographing height.